afternoon and welcome to Dancing on the Ceiling, Music in the Brain. I'm Francis Levy. Ed Recessian and I are co-directors of the Philoctetes Center, and it's really a tremendous pleasure to be here today and having Jane Ira Bloom, who's worked very hard on this. We've talked about this for a long time, and we're very much looking forward to this particular panel. Jane has done, as many of you know, a number of musical events here, and this is a little bit different than the format that she's usually brought to Philoctetes, in that she's going to be playing in a roundtable context. Usually, Jane is usually up here with another performer, and they talk about their work and perform it. It's part of the jazz series. I just wanted to make a few announcements. The current show on aggression is attendant upon our 6-part panel on aggression, which has included on aggression, the politics and psychobiology of war, the politics and psychobiology of genocide. We did an initial panel just called On Aggression that was related to Conrad, sort of referentially related to the Conrad Lorenz, the classic tome by Conrad Lorenz, the ethologist. And we have another On Aggression panel, the politics and psychobiology of sex and violence, coming up on April 5th. Now, this particular exhibition, these are the photographs of Alex Gibbons, and it relates to the testimony of the survivors of the Rwanda genocide. These in back are works on paper by the well-known artist Joyce Kozloff, and then in back, Robin Toos, who gives you a more, shall we say, distillated and sublimated view of aggression as it appears in motifs in her paintings. And Leah Poller and Joy Garnard's paintings are also represented, and Hallie Cohn has done an amazing job on that. She's the chairman of the art department at Marymount Manhattan College, and Adam Ludwig helped her on this show. We're very proud of this particular show. Many of you know that Philoctetes Center has been hit hard by the current financial crisis, and in particular the scandal relating to the Madoff affair. And so we're in a lot of trouble, but we are proceeding. Every month we just make it. And so we need your help, and we've been getting it. And so I don't want to sound redundant, but every week I kind of remind people about this. If you're interested in one aspect of our program, like the videography, all Philoctetes events are shot on a 3-camera setup, and they're simulcast. So this is appearing all on the internet. If you go to philoctetes.org, anywhere in the world, you can see this. And then we archive it, and it goes to our past programming. If you go to our home site, you can see, for those of you who aren't aware of that, see any Philoctetes event in the past, and it's a wonderful thing, but it costs money. So if you like that, send in money on that. We have a poetry series. We have a Living in the Musical Moment is one of our jazz series, and Jane has done another jazz series. And we have a classical music series. Don't silence your cell phones. Let's just keep it all. Let's go for it. I hate when they tell me to silence my cell phone. I mean to silence it, but I'm not. Why? I mean, so many other constrictions. But anyway, we need your help. And what we really need to do is we need to make it to the end of 2009. That's what we need to do. And we've applied for all kinds of grants. We're hopeful to get some, but we're struggling. We don't want this. We don't want it to die. We want it to live. And so I need more aggression. Some of the other environments that we've been in need less aggression. So that's what we need to do. So I'm now pleased to introduce Jane Ira Bloom. Jane Ira Bloom is a soprano saxophonist, composer, and a pioneer in the use of live electronics and movement in jazz. She is the winner of the 2007 Guggenheim Fellowship in Music Composition, the 2007 Mary Lou Williams Women in Jazz Award for Lifetime Service to Jazz, the Jazz Journalists Association Award, and the Downbeat International Critics Poll for soprano saxophone, and the Charlie Parker Fellowship for Jazz Innovation. Oxygen. Bloom was the first musician commissioned by the NASA Art Program and has an asteroid named in her honor by the International Astronomical Union. I like an asteroid. I take a planet, though, maybe. She has received numerous commissions and has composed for the American Composers Orchestra, the St. Luke's Chamber Ensemble, the Polobolus Dance Theater, integrating jazz performers in new settings. She has recorded and produced 13 albums of her wonderful music, and please, I think you have some to sell afterwards, don't you?
Yeah, they're in the back.
Yeah, they're great. I mean, I have them all, and they're just fantastic. I have a few can sell you also. No. It holds degrees from Yale University and the Yale School of Music. Bloom is currently on the faculty of the New School for Jazz and Contemporary Music in New York City. Her latest release is the award-winning CD, Mental Weather. Jane Ira Bloom will moderate this afternoon's event and introduce our other distinguished guests. So,
okay.
Take it away, Jane.
Thank you. I will try. This is the point where I usually pick up my instrument, and I'm going to be doing something very different today. But first, let me start by thanking these extraordinary people who are joining me here today. And I do want to read, I'll condense a little bit, but tell you a little bit about them. On my right, Jim Anderson, internationally recognized recording engineer and producer of acoustic music for recording, radio, television, film, acoustic guru to musicians who know him. His recordings have received 9 Grammy Awards, 25 Grammy nominations. His recordings have received George Foster Peabody Awards, Emmy nominations. It goes on and on. He was employed by National Public Radio, produced many award-winning classical, jazz, documentary, and news programs. Since 1980, Jim has had a career as an independent audio engineer and producer, lecturer and master classes at many prestigious universities around the world. And he's presently professor and former chair of the Clive Davis Department of Recorded Music at the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, and also the president of the Audio Engineering Society, 2008-2009. Thank you for coming, Jim. To Jim's right is Taoufiq Ben Amor, our first-time meeting. Born in Tunis to a Sufi family of the Qadiri order. With a musician father, he learned percussion and singing at a young age. 2 decades ago, he started learning the oud, an Arabic maqam system with Mohammed Labad, Jamal Aslan, Simon Shaheen, and Shadihia School of Andalusian Music. He's an active music performer, educator, and producer, and currently senior lecturer in Arabic studies at Columbia University. Many, many papers and topics, of which I'm afraid I can't pronounce many of them, if that's okay. But absolutely and truly honored to have him here today as a musician and professor of Arabic studies. To my left, Josh McDermott, who I have to admit to you was the focal point of where the idea this came from. We even quoted something from one of your papers at the top of this description. Josh just recently joined the Center for Neuroscience at NYU as a postdoctoral researcher. He studies sound and hearing, conducting experiments on humans and designing computational audio algorithms, has long-standing research interests in music perception and cognition. Earlier in life, he spent his free time DJing in clubs and on the radio, and to this day remains an avid collector of vinyl records. His scientific interests in music focus on understanding how musical structures are represented in the auditory system and what this can reveal about the origins of music. And to his left, we're honored to have Alexander Stein. Has a polymodal career as a psychoanalyst, a business consultant, author, journalist, teacher, and scholar. A member, training analyst, and supervisor at NPAP, and maintains clinical and business consulting practices in New York. A principal of the Boswell Group, a psychoanalytic consulting partnership. He advises business leaders and entrepreneurs. He also writes a monthly column for Fortune Small Business on psychological dimensions of business and entrepreneurship, drawing on his pre-psychoanalytic life as a conservatory-trained pianist. Stein writes and lectures extensively on the conjoined study of music and psychoanalysis, author of many scholarly works. Recently delivered the Aaron Eisman Richard History of Psychiatric Research seminar lecture on music at Weill Cornell Medical College, and is organizing a weekend conference entitled Singing and Writing with Tongues of Wood for New Directions in Psychoanalytic Thinking in Washington, D.C. This is quite an accomplished group of people who are sitting here today. One thing I must say that's interesting about every one of them that I've read to the definition is that they all are practitioners in some way of music. Jim was a French horn player, Taoufiq, oud and percussion and voice. Mm-hmm. This man was a DJ artist, and we welcome you to the ranks of musicians. Alexander Stein, concert pianist, bringing a very, what I think is a pretty special perspective to a topic. So here we are, music, a uniquely human endeavor. Only humans do it. So
do
far as
you think so? Well,
Last week we had somebody who was recording waves. You were there.
I wouldn't make that one about bird song and such. I'll bet Josh can speak to this. Well, where we can start from is that it's ubiquitous throughout the world, music, and it makes us wonder why. Why is music so important? How and why did it evolve? And I guess I'll begin just by asking Josh to start, because it's a topic that was the generation for why he went into the research that he does. And would you mind just start telling people about your research and what compelled you to start there?
Certainly. Yeah, so I guess, I got into this business because I'd always loved music. And I was initially trained in sort of other areas of science. But at some point I decided I ought to try to figure out the answers to some of these questions that I was just kind of wondering about on a daily basis. And most of the work that I do, I guess, at its root is motivated by this question of why there is music and why we like it. Why it is that there are these sound signals that can make people feel things, and that motivate people to go to great lengths to obtain them. And it's just not really obvious why that ought to be the case. I suppose chiefly because, if you think about a lot of the other things that people find very rewarding, like good food or cocaine or sex.
We order of preference.
All of these things, when you give them to people, they activate certain parts of the brain that are involved in the sensation of reward. And in various ways, we think we understand why that is the case. So in the case of food or of sex, those serve very important functions to a biological organism. You need calories in order to reproduce, and you need to have the motivation to reproduce in order to reproduce. And reproducing is the whole point of being an organism from the standpoint of evolution. So we understand why there are these drives to get food or to have sex. In the case of cocaine, we think that the brain is being tricked into finding something rewarding that doesn't really have any intrinsic value. But again, we think we understand roughly why that happens. But in the case of music, it's really not so clear. Because it doesn't seem that there's some fundamental biological function that is really aided by music, at least not one that is uncontroversial in any sense. And so it's a little bit bizarre that, it seems to be this universal feature of human culture. In every culture, people devote lots of resources in order to engage in music. And in fact, this was one of the few things that Darwin was really worried about back, when he was putting forth his theories of evolution. He's trying to explain all these human behaviors in terms of the functional benefit that they would give to an organism. And music was one thing where he was really perplexed. And so there's this statement in his book, The Descent of Man, where he sort of owns up to this. And people have really been wondering and arguing about it ever since. So in various ways, most of the things that I've done are at root trying to get at that issue. I've done, initially I did some work in animals actually to try to probe whether or not they share any of the same capacities that humans have for understanding music. Didn't seem like they did, at least in my hands. But I've done a lot of work trying to understand whether there are any brain processes that are involved in the analysis and perception of musical signals that might be specific to music, that might provide us with some clues as to whether or not there is something that evolved in order to enable us to appreciate music. And I think the jury is still out, but I don't think the field has any particularly compelling examples of things that seem to be specific to music as opposed to being shared with other cognitive processes like language, for instance. But we're still looking. And like I said, the jury's out. So that's sort of a little taste of what I do.
How do you test? What process do you use to test, what's going on in music?
It depends on the situation. There's a whole sort of standard toolbox of things that we use to try to understand a cognitive process. So one thing, for instance, you can do is if you suspect that there are two cognitive processes that involve similar resources, you can try to force people to use them at the same time to see if that impairs their performance. So, for instance, to give you an example, if you present people with a series of chords where there's a chord that is sort of grammatically incorrect according to the rules of your musical idiom, so that if you play it to a normal listener, they'll hear this and they'll say, "Oh, that's wrong." You know, it's as though someone played the wrong thing, someone made a mistake. But you can do the same thing with language, where you can play people or present them with a series of words, one of which is ungrammatical according to the syntax of the language. And it turns out that when you do this, the brain responses that normally occur to the ungrammatical chord and to the ungrammatical word are attenuated when you're presented with both of them at once. And people have taken that as evidence that the process of determining whether something is grammatical musically and grammatical linguistically in some way taps into similar resources, which suggests that perhaps a lot of the structural processing that occurs in music may be kind of piggybacking on mechanisms for producing linguistic structure. So that's sort of one example. Another thing that you can do is scan people's brains and look what sorts of brain areas are active when they're doing certain things. You can also look at people who've suffered strokes and who have damage to particular brain regions. There are very interesting examples of unfortunate individuals who have lost the capacity to appreciate music following brain damage. And that can often be revealing. It's also of interest to test animals, because animals don't, well, this is a slightly contentious statement, but I've certainly argued that animals don't have music in any of the same senses that people do. And certainly our closest animal relatives, the apes, don't really engage in anything that people would want to call song. So it's interesting to test them and to see if you present them with musical structures, whether they can, whether it seems that they can hear the same sorts of things that people do when they hear those. Because if they do, that's some evidence that the appreciation of those structures doesn't necessarily depend on something that might have evolved from music, because the animals don't have that.
I recall reading something about some research about they were comparing chimps' ability to make differentiations in sound and timbre and rhythm and tempo, and infants, 6-month-old infants, they found out the babies are better at it. Yeah. I guess chimps could figure out octaves and things like that, but when it came to listening to a tune in different keys and a different tempo, babies had it all over the chimps.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite remarkable, actually, that at a few months of age, an infant seems to recognize the pattern of pitch changes that would characterize a melody. But you can do things like you'll train a monkey up to recognize a particular melody, and then you transpose it up or down, and they sort of had to start all over again learning it. So that seems pretty strange. Yeah.
Well, we should. One thing that comes to my mind that maybe we should go to this side of the table is, I don't know if any of you guys have noticed this, but the things that I've, at least to popular culture, the things that I've written about science and music, or neuroscience and music, seem to have an ethnocentric bent to them. Often the researchers are Western scientists who are studying either classical music as their template, or sometimes popular music, but always Western. And it's a big question, but Taoufiq, I mean, but what from the point of view of musics of the world, what unique could be learned and I don't know why test, but learned about and explored differently in world music than in Western art music?
What I was thinking about, actually, as I was listening to you, is all the different functions that music does, and I was wondering, like in your model, for example, if there would be room for a talking drum, where you're basically beating this log or drum or whatever, but then the purpose is we need to communicate something as opposed to playing music, and where do you draw the line between those? I think that if we see music more like in the limited sense of what we hear in a concert hall or recorded, or which is wonderful and all that, it might be limiting a little bit all the amazing functions that it does. And I'm thinking of people using drums and music, for example, to induce terror in their enemies during war. So you basically hear these thundering drums, as people are coming in, to meet another war party, and the effect of that. So there's another function of music, that you're looking at. There's music that is used in ritual to induce trance. And this I would be fascinated about because, I come from that background, but I've never been able to have a scientific approach to it. Why, for example, is it that people use frame drums if they ever use drums, in the music? And what effect does that have? What effect does, for example, the decision not to use any instruments? And I'm talking about the Sufism, which is the mystical branch of Islam, in which music plays a major role in this, ritual. So the music becomes really functional, and then it serves the purpose of reaching a certain state of mind, of revealing truth, or seeing things, or having a union with God, and all that. And it's really amazing how each school allows for certain instruments or doesn't allow for certain instruments. So what happens if you're only clapping and breathing and singing, as opposed to having drums, accompany that, and how do both induce, that state? So I'm just pointing to a few functions within which, music happens, and then add to that the regional color. But from what I know, I've seen a lot of cultures use music as a way of experiencing the spiritual and the divine as part of ritual, and we hear it in church, mosque, synagogue, everywhere. And in that way, they might do it slightly differently, of course, but it's very similar in that sense. I don't think it's very different. So what would be fascinating to me is to hear more of what you have to say, in terms of understanding this knowledge that you could approach in one way or on another. In Sufi schools, generally, this is history. This is the knowledge that is passed on. And the approach is so hands-on. You basically participate in the ritual. You don't ask yourself the question of why is it that this particular note is creating this. You believe that this is sacred knowledge that has been perfected over thousands of years, and that there's some value to it. And in a way, it presents an incredible continuation, to all of that. I don't know if I addressed your question, but
It's absolutely the direction I was thinking about. I think again, I just read a lot of things for lay people about neuroscience and music. The only thing I ever spotted was some study that was talking about how cortisol levels, stress hormones, can be triggered by music, into a tense state. But also there are different hormones, and you can probably tell us about this, that also can create states of relaxation and meditation. Mm-hmm. And the only study I saw where they dealt with things other than Western art music was they had some participants listening to Shankar, to this sitar. And they found what you might expect, that the sound of the sitar immediately created this reduction in a stress hormone. I don't know why, because I'm thinking of this. I'll just give you an example, just so you can feel what this test might have been about. I'm going to play for you a digital tambura, which is the drone instrument that is used in India. It's North India. Just tell me how you feel about hearing this for a little while. I'm turning it off very carefully because what I've found, I practice with this very often, and it's very disconcerting once you get into that musical sound to turn it off. I find it disturbing, actually, but I just thought I'd throw that in.
It's interesting the overtones that they have here. I mean, it's like the whole overtonal thing, that you hear in music. The sympathetic strings that they have, on sitar. Basically, as you play in the main strings and notes, you have this set of sympathetic strings that respond at different octaves, and the kind of width that it gives, in terms of perhaps as an engineer, you probably
Jim can speak to
this, much better than me. But it definitely is something unique about the sitar for me when I hear it. And the tambura too is kind of doing the, sort of the same thing in a way.
You can feel it.
Yeah, you can feel it.
Jim, tell us.
Well, I started thinking about, when I hear that, I start wondering where they got the sample. How is the sample made? What's,
Pretty good one. I'm told that the North Indian musicians use this box when they don't want to hire the tambura player.
Which they don't anymore, unfortunately.
So, I think that's the problem of someone who is in the profession of doing this, because you have a couple of different brains that you can use. One is the brain that appreciates music for music's sake, and the other one is when you start trying to dissect the product, almost like a musician would if they start listening to it harmonically in tempo. An audio engineer starts listening to it and starting to say, well, what are the components that are being made up here? How is it created? Is it, now you think, is it analog, is it digital? Does it have the artifacts? Is it a convincing sample? Because I come into it as a practitioner, as someone who is trying to create a reality that may or may not exist. Recording. If it's a studio recording, we are trying to find elements that we can use to create this alternate reality. I know we've talked about this in the past, because a recording is not reality, and reality is not a recording. If you try to just exactly give yourself what's there. Now, classical music is a different story. But if you're dealing in, say, jazz or pop music, there's a real element of manipulation that you have to go through to actually make a convincing product that will affect the brain. I think I was wondering if some of the things that we do, we're trying to trick the brain into believing that that works.
Where is it, Jim, in your experience or in your past or in some place, or where in all of ours, that we can listen to the same piece of work that you're engineering or mixing and say, that's right, that feels right? And why do we agree? What is it? What are we using? Is it our memory? Is it what is it? Memory of sound? Is it what?
Well, certainly it's your background comes into play, and we all come to it with different backgrounds. I may come to it as a kind of a technical background. You would come to it as a musical background, and I think we are able to suspend belief here for a moment, knowing that we're listening to an artifact or to a recording, and it is not reality. The other side. I'm listening to it as an audio product, but also there's the other reality of manipulation of editing. So you have that other kind of a deception that's being created too. And again, if the editing is convincing, then the ear is I believe is the most difficult sense to trick. I think visually you can sort of get away with a lot of things, but the ear really will recognize a discontinuity.
Talk a little bit about, I can ask Jim these questions because we've worked together for about, I don't know how many years, 20 years in the recording studio. Talk a little bit about room sound and creating an image of a place in your sound picture when you mix. What is that about? Placing music in a place. Why? Why do we have to do that?
Well, we have a couple of things to deal with. One is a recording studio is just sort of like a clean, well-lighted place that we can make a recording in, so we're not going to get outside disturbances or subway sounds or things like that. So we start with a very clear and very clean source to begin with. But that may not necessarily be a very attractive sound. It's not like a concert hall.
How do you know what's attractive? How do you know it's a sound that we like? This is a question Josh asked.
I think you come to it. Well, we now have a history of about 100 years worth of recordings, and so that people before us wouldn't have had. So I have a 50 years of reference that I can say I would like to make a recording as good as something that Kind of Blue or something like that. I'm trying to make a recording that is that good. Now, I remember it was interesting. A couple of records ago, I started using a different atmosphere box, a reverb box, and I remember you took the recordings home, and I think your husband said something like, "Now you got it," and we were using a new kind of interpolation reverb, and it was a Sony, and they had used actual spaces to create the digital component of the reverb. And I felt that the sound, the source, was sticking to this artificial reverb much better than it had in the past. And it was interesting when you took it home that Joe actually said, "That sounds really good. What are you guys doing differently?" And he picked up on it in a second.
Instantly.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joe.
Okay. Joe doesn't remember that, so.
It's interesting too because in a way you're saying that as you're looking for this aesthetic of sound, you're also affecting aesthetic, in a way that people, are going to listen to the music that you make, and it becomes unto itself, the basis for a way of listening. The tambora sound that we listen to is really based on an Indian aesthetic. The Indian aesthetic is you stay in the same scale, the same rag, for hours. And you don't, and the tonic that you play is extremely important. So that sound will be dominant all the way through. If it's an A, it's going to be on A, for the duration of a whole rag that has to be played within a certain time of the day because it induces certain feelings and a certain color and all of these things. You have to use certain instruments and etc. So somehow there's, once again, that whole aesthetic that's built on this ancient knowledge that, that evolved, that thinks it's going to induce the desired feeling, within the listener. But it's really interesting to listen to you because you obviously have standards that you think are, Kind of Blue is a great, we all agree that's an amazing recording. But
what makes it great?
Well, I think, first off, musically, it's just outstanding. But I think part of it has a classic appeal in that, I heard it maybe 40 years ago, about maybe 8 years after it was recorded. It felt fresh then. I listen to it now. It still feels fresh. And it's also a kind of an accessibility of the music. But at the same time, it was a studio session that was only 2-3 hour sessions. I think they used about 9 microphones, and it was on a 3-track, and everyone was in the same room, and just sort of sectioned off very easily, but nothing drastic, so they could hear each other. There were no headphones. I think part of the problem with today's recordings, when you put on headphones, you're hearing at the speed of light. And if you're working in a studio with no headphones, you're hearing at the speed of sound. And I think that you work a different direction that way.
And the interaction too, like of the musicians being able to see each other, to physically feel each other's sound, as opposed to being, boxed up, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Behind.
But the problem today with a lot of musicians is they will not play in a certain aesthetic that's proper to the group and to the room that they're playing in. And so you actually have to do this manipulation to actually get a finished, polished sound out of it. So you sort of have to make that compromise to get the ultimate effect of the final, like they got so easily in Kind of Blue.
Do you feel that multi-tracking, like for example, if a group came in and laid one track or two and then they left, came tomorrow and put in something, that there's going to be a difference, in sound because of the temporal difference, in time, and that certain factors changed, or?
The one thing I think that tends to happen when you multi-track is people tend to put off decisions. And so at NYU, about 2 weeks ago, I had a 9-piece group in the studio, and we were using analog tape. And we had 24 tracks, and we had 15 minutes of tape, period. Now, in most times you can say, oh, let's keep that, let's do another one. But here we had physical limitations saying we can't keep every take. We can only use a certain amount of tracks. Do you like it or don't you like it? And forcing them to make these decisions. And also, and we might not have enough time left on the tape, or we might not, somebody may have made a mistake and not wound back far enough, so we don't have enough time. Do you like the, these are decisions that people don't have to make these days. And so they sort of cheat, and they go in a little bit sloppy and a little bit lazy. And I like when musicians come in with that edge. And so if you lay things out a certain way, you may not be able to replace every single note. I know the way that we work, we're not looking to replace total solos or anything. Frankly, we couldn't anyway. And again, that puts the kind of the onus on you and the band.
Well, sure. Most jazz musicians would not go in that direction, but I think people would be surprised to know how much
You'd be surprised somebody try to do that.
Try.
Can I get away with putting a new line on top?
Why do people want to be perfect? Why do they want music that sounds perfect? I don't know. Well, anyway, we got to get Alexander in on this. I'll just throw something out and you can jump in or whatever. But as a concert pianist and a psychoanalyst, he's written so beautifully about music. And I'm just paraphrasing Alexander, but as a container for the sound of memory and the emotional music of each individual's early life. And I read this paper and I was just knocked out. So anyway, I just wondered if you might just talk a little bit about that function that perhaps music has as you see it from your discipline.
There are so many different perspectives to take on this. In one respect, I like to flip some of these ideas upside down. I think less of music as a form of communication and more communication as a form of music. Thinking about how we can experience the sound making of an individual and process it in ways similar to how we process music. In other words, having a purely affective, almost primary process response to something that we hear, and parsing out the semantic or the linguistic components of language so that you hear my words and you understand that I'm saying something and it's grammatically structured. But when we listen to music, we're not necessarily thinking, I could stop right there, perhaps. And so we're not processing the experience of music listening as cognition, really, even if there are cognitive processes that are activated. So from a psychoanalytic perspective, music communicates the idea of auditory symbolism, sound as a conveyor of affect and ideation. We listen to someone speaking about something, not necessarily listening to what they're saying, but what is the emotional content of what they're saying. And in this respect, I think that there's a consonance between the neuroscience and the psychoanalytic, perhaps.
Could I pop in for a second?
Sure, and please,
What
you guys go.
makes me think is every musician that I know has a voice. And so if you hear Stan Getz, you know that's Stan Getz. You hear Zoot Sims, that's Zoot, Coltrane. And there are some people that look at you when you say, oh, that's Jane playing. And they'll look and, how do you know that? I just know that. I don't know what it is that's put that stamp on my brain that, you can recognize a trumpet player, a trumpet, and then a trumpet player, and how they have that
It's
very...
unconscious. It's got
Most of perception is kind of got that flavor, right? I mean, we don't know how we see, right? I mean, you just open your eyes and the world is there, right? I mean, but there's 60% of your brain is hard at work, trying to build a representation of the world from the photons that hit your retina, right? And yeah, I think it's that's perception. I mean, there's all these complicated inferential processes going on, but they're unconscious, and it's not until you actually try to figure out how they work that you realize how horrendously complicated most of the stuff is. So.
Well, having partially caught the question that you threw out, I want to throw something back out in a way to try and connect the idea of the evolution of something. I don't think as a psychoanalytic anthropologist about music. In other words, I'm not terribly focused on the origins of music. I am interested in the origins of each person's music. So if you think about early development, you spoke of 6-month-olds, for instance, and their relationship to sound. Pre-conscious and unconscious audition is something that occurs all the time, and how we experience the world in the auditory realm is not necessarily something that we think about all the time, particularly in psychoanalytic theory. The visual has really dominated, the idea of gaze, for instance. The sound world has a remarkable place in recognition, in identity formation, in character development, in relationship building. It all plays a significant role, for instance, in some of the subphases of development and independence. If you think about how a toddler, for instance, can crawl into another room and still be in earshot of a parent, and so you have a kind of auditory umbilicus. The parent and the child know each other is there without visual connection, and so you have a sense of safety without presence. And this is something that only happens with sound. The way in which the absence of the visual can enhance feelings of safety in that regard, or anxiety on another, for instance, in darkness, when you have no visual mapping and you just hear sounds, which can be scary. All of these play their part in an acculturated context in the development of what we think of as consonant or dissonant, or pleasurable or not pleasurable. And with those words, I would add, it always interests me as a psychoanalyst and as a musician when the hard scientists talk about their focus on pleasure, or the purposeful pursuit of pleasure, in tracing the origin of something, because of course we humans are not particularly well known for the purposeful pursuit of pleasure. We like things that feel good, that aren't necessarily rational or purposeful at all. So the fact that music doesn't seem to serve a purpose doesn't mean that it doesn't have a great purpose for us as humans. And there's probably a lot more we can say about that. You mentioned cocaine, that would be a good example.
Well, you mentioned also why do we like sad songs?
Yeah, there's a musicologist named Stephen Davies who wrote a paper in '97, I think, called "Why Do We Listen to Sad Music If It Makes Us Sad?"
I love that.
Which really aptly captures a very interesting question. And of course, music is expressive of and allows us to receive also so many different forms of affect, not just pleasurable ones. We should certainly put in a shout for dissonance and clashing major minor crushes of sounds. And I mean, there's just so much music that is designed, in fact, to give us a kind of pleasurable agitation or a desirable anguish.
Right. But I feel like we're talking also about the function of music in a very Darwinian sense. I mean, why isn't social function a function? Like I said, for example, terrorizing your enemy, or beating a drum, so that the next village knows, that the floods are coming or something. I mean, why isn't that a survival function as well?
Well, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no question that music, like many things, has been co-opted in different places to serve certain functions. What's unclear is whether there's anything that is sort of fundamental enough and ubiquitous enough to really explain the fact that it exists. So, in the sense that sex has this ubiquitous fundamental function, or eating has this ubiquitous fundamental function. So,
Right.
I mean, it certainly is used for lots of things in lots of different cultures. It's unclear whether those things are are important enough to really have contributed to the fact that we have music. And we also it's just not clear what the functions were at the time that it came about. That's also sort of a bit mysterious.
Right.
The fossil record doesn't really give us many clues as to when music first developed. I mean, we don't even know, for instance, if music preceded language or came after it. And
Right.
I had a question that is sort of along the lines that you were talking about and that you just talked about in relationship to music and what's so-called lower brain activities, because you were emphasizing the cortical areas. I mean, obviously recognition and identity formation, so forth. But does music tie us to the animal emotion, that aspect of the human which has to do with animal, the midbrain and the lower brain functions is talked about a lot now in neuroscience areas. Does music have an effect on those types of those emotions which we have in common with animals?
Josh, you want to take that first?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think music sort of taps into all different sorts of emotions. I mean, some of those are probably. I mean, what are the things that we share with animals? I mean, things like fear, maybe.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as we know, there are a lot of animal species that have this same sense of reward that humans do. So, like I was saying before, I mean, when you play people pieces of music that they love, you find these reward systems active, which also happens if you give them good food or cocaine or whatever. And those are also systems that we seem to have, that they go way back evolutionarily, and that will be active in animals, if you give them something that they like. Not music, unfortunately, but food and such seems to do that.
Certainly pain, too.
Yeah. So some of those are shared.
Because that's the question about why sadness. Because to me, I thought catharsis, but I thought that animals, that there's a sort of tie-in there between there's a certain relief provided in music, and I'm wondering if that.
I mean, I'm not sure if the sadness. I mean, I think the sadness question is fascinating. I'm not sure if there's anything about it that's sort of special to music. I mean, you could ask the same thing about film. Like, why is it that people like to go see films that make them sad? I mean, I don't know.
But there's a pleasurable side to sadness. It's not all.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably lots of reasons why we get something out of that sort of thing. But I'm not sure that's really that question is particularly pertinent with regard to music as opposed to just lots of other things as well.
But I still want to go back to this business of kind of blue. When you just start hearing that, it does something to you, inevitably. And what is it that it does? What is happening that you have an emotional, almost a gut reaction, a bodily reaction, not just a kind of auditory reaction, but a bodily reaction to this music?
Well,
there are many such things. I'm just using.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that happen. I mean, part of the challenge that I get confronted with as a scientist, right, is I'm interested. That's what I'm interested in, right? I'm interested in the fact that there are these recordings that are amazing, that blow people away, But those recordings are complicated, and it seems very likely that there are many, many, many things that are in the recording and many things that are in the brain that interact in complicated ways to give rise to that experience. So the challenge, if you really want to study this scientifically, is to find kind of simple elements that we think are at play in these the most interesting, complex examples of music, but that are simple enough that we can manipulate them in the lab and study them to try to figure out what happens. Because if you give me Kind of Blue, it's a bit hopeless, right? I mean, there's lots and lots of things that are going on there. Now I could tell you a story about what many of those things are, but to actually test those rigorously, we have to isolate them, and that the challenge is to not let that reductionist approach sort of take you so far away from the thing you're originally interested in, and that's hard. That's hard, and sometimes you're left with the feeling, well, maybe I just kind of lost it, So
There's a story that I heard once that tried to neatly explain some of the differences between a psychoanalytic and a neuroscience approach, which is, a parchment paper or a book washes up on a shore in a bottle, and the neuroscientist takes the book out of the bottle and analyzes every aspect of it, from the fiber in the paper to the construction of the ink, and deciphers the hieroglyphs on the page and is able to render a translation and understand its semiotic significance. But what doesn't get analyzed is the subjective experience of reading it or of the creation of it. And so here I think we need to think about the evolutionary significance of fantasy and imagination as human beings. That when we're talking about music as well as any of these other aesthetic structures, we're talking about the transformation of human experience into another form, which is then communicable to others.
This is closer to my experience, yes.
I think that there's a wonderful dialogue that we can have with fMRI and other mechanisms to help us understand what's happening to us when this is happening. But I'm not sure that it will necessarily tell us absolutely everything about what's happening.
Well, I suppose I wouldn't completely agree with your characterization in the sense that I think I'm very interested in subjective experience. It's just that I need to be able to measure something in a way that's reliable. And the subjective experience that you have when you listen to Kind of Blue is not really very measurable because it's very complicated. And there are many things that are going on, and there are many things that are going on in the stimulus, right? And so trying to understand that mapping between the stimulus and the state that it evokes in a listener is very difficult. And so I don't want to throw out the subjective experience. I just want to be dealing with a subjective experience that I have some hope of understanding. And like I said, sometimes you run the risk that you're left with a subjective experience that maybe isn't that interesting. That's sort of the scientific challenge. So
Would it be wrong to say, Josh, that a subjective feeling is part of the creative process of how you come up with an experiment or an idea for a research idea? Because you intuit something?
Oh, definitely, yeah. It's a very nonlinear process.
I understand, yeah.
And I think the act of doing science, has a lot in common with the act of doing art. In the sense that you have these sort of moments of inspiration. You don't really know where they come from. I get them when I'm in the shower usually, and or whatever. And so you get these ideas, and then, but eventually you sort of have to you make them sort of rigorous, but there's certainly a lot of things that probably bubble up from the unconscious in some sense, and I know people that have dreams and they wake up and they have some idea, and that ends up doing something good. So,
but what we're calling subjective is what is paranormal, or is it that which science cannot explain? See, the point that I'm trying to bring in is how do you explain, for example, a Sufi trance where people start doing all of these physical things that are hard to explain, to their bodies, but they're in a state that apparently we scientifically and also thinking, and I'm thinking historically here, I'm not even thinking of science, just as science, but as a stage in which humanity is really thinking of the human experience in very empirical terms. How do you explain a trance? How do you explain, that somebody is really capable of cutting themselves up, simply because they listen to this music, and now they're in a state where their bodies can handle that. So perhaps this is also part of our experience, whether we want to call it subjective or not. Seems to me like a very temporal way of looking at it. It's a very contextualized way of looking at the human experience and the human mind and the human being, sort of as the product of an empirical approach that's so common in the West, for the past 200 years.
By subjective, I simply mean interior.
Personal.
Yeah,
personal.
An interdisciplinary conversation like this, I think, really is the approach. We're trying to build a kind of bipartisan consortium in which different perspectives will yield another facet of something that perhaps is not fully explained only by one.
Right.
But I guess I think that this issue of trance, that's something we could plausibly understand. It's just we have to characterize it first.
Right.
And that might be that's challenging in some cases. But I wouldn't have thought that. I don't think the fact that something is subjective means that it's much more difficult to understand necessarily. You just have to have some way of measuring the subjective state of the observer. But there are lots of examples of that in psychology, where different people think different things or see different things, and we can try to get a handle on why that is, by measuring that and by measuring other things about them and looking at patterns of those differences.
Earlier I was thinking of, because we were talking about like evolution in history and how music has started, etc. And I was thinking of, this ritual, just as an example of, the Tuareg in the Sahel, the men when they come of age and they're about to marry, one of the old traditions is that they meet in this one place once a year. People come in from all sorts of tribes, and then they color themselves up, get really beautiful, and then the men start jumping and singing non-stop for days. And the idea is actually that as the men are doing that, the women are going around and actually choosing, their mates. And here I'm seeing music as a way almost of showing like prowess, like of showing, that you're really physically fit. And I wonder if the women are also listening for a certain voice, for a certain articulation, for a certain thing, where it's almost like, this is bird singing, in a way. This is like, birds flashing their colors a little bit, trying to attract the females. And apparently we humans do that. You will correct me on this, but it seems that the human voice is like so important in attraction. It's like, it's one of the things you listen to, like in a partner, and it's like such an important thing. So how do we relate all of this in a way that expands? I'm making the same point. That expands the way in which we define music, and what is a piece of music.
I think, broadly speaking, going back to what James was saying at the start, it's a very important point to emphasize that the science of music has very much a sort of Western tint. It's a big problem. Most of us that do this are Westerners, and we're trained in sort of the Western idiom. It's a huge problem, particularly because with regard to evolution, the question of what is universal about music is important and deeply interesting, and we just don't really know that much about it, and it's getting harder and harder to study because Western music is pretty much taking over the world. All these places where you used to be able to go to do cross-cultural studies, you go to Indonesia now and the kids listen to Eminem. It's there's a rapidly diminishing set of places where you can go to find people that don't have massive exposure to Western music. And it's so difficult to get there and to just physically do studies that very few people, are braving that territory. So, I'm hoping that there's going to be a push over the next 10 years or so to actually do this stuff while we still have a chance, because it's really important. Another thing that you're raising, which I think is also really important, is the role of music in ritual, because that is one thing that does really seem to be universal. In pretty much every culture where you look, music is always associated with rituals of some sort, and that's probably important. It probably tells us something.
Does your work touch on the movement of the body with music? Is some of the work you've ever done touched on that area?
I haven't done a ton of that myself. It's something that a lot of people are getting interested in over the past couple years.
Why do we move?
It's weird.
We feel it?
It's definitely one of the weirder things that we do.
It happens to be particular to my playing. It's something I'm personally very interested in. And,
and that also is something that seems to be pretty universal. That people move involuntarily on the beat. It's one challenge in that is that it's a little bit unclear whether that behavior is something that we learn or whether it's something that we sort of are born with. you can't really look at it in infants because the motor coordination is so poor that they just physically can't move rhythmically that well. Productively, it's one of the last behaviors to come online. And it's so late that it's really hard to know whether do the kids learn this from watching adults or
Could we
or
call
what?
this as early dance?
Maybe, yeah. There are some pretty interesting studies with animals actually on this, where people, you guys have probably seen these videos on YouTube, where if you go on YouTube and you type dancing cockatoo, you'll see a video of this bird who was dropped off at an animal shelter, and the owner gave him a CD as well, and he said, "Play track 8. The bird really likes this." And so if you play track 8, and it's unfortunately not a very good record, it's the Backstreet Boys, but you play track 8, and the bird goes nuts, and it starts doing these rhythmic movements in time with the beat. I mean, it's.
I have to back you up with this. I'm sorry, I sound like I'm bringing all the insane in there or the different. But horses in Arab tradition follow rhythm. We have dancing horses. We have a tradition of horses that actually dance, and you can find it on YouTube. Just put dancing horse. It's true. And then you'll see these horses actually really react. In the Arab tradition too, there used to be a guy who in the caravan would play the flute, the reed flute, because it's believed to put the camels in a good state where they can endure, the heat and it was a specific function for one particular person to do it.
Yeah.
And a whole genre of singing that was actually built on that. So the idea that animals are affected by music is kind of known.
But isn't that important because of the connection between the auditory system and the ability to balance yourself and the cerebellum are so tightly connected?
I think it's unclear. It seems like there is some linkage. I was at a meeting a little while ago and saw these pretty amazing videos where music is being used to rehabilitate patients with Parkinson's who have trouble walking. So they have trouble walking on their own, but then you give them a soundtrack with a beat, and then they can do it. So there is some kind of deep link there.
People who speak with a stutter or a stammer also lose that when they're singing.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess that's true, yeah.
Who was the country western singer that Mel Tillis, right? He would say, do you want me to, in the interview, do you want me to be Mel Tillis or shall I be myself? If he was himself, he would stutter like crazy, but if he was Mel Tillis and he could speak or he could sing, he was fine. You'd never know there was this dichotomy.
Well, I just wanted to add, though, in terms of trying to trace some of the evolution, some thinking on the origins of stammering is something to do with psychosexual problems early on. So, why does that go away when you're singing?
Yeah. I was going to ask you too, is it true also that people who have Alzheimer's, and I've lived this experience also with the father of a friend of mine who was having Alzheimer's, but then, I was visiting them and then he would ask to be introduced. He would say, "Who's that?" And I have to introduce me to him all the time. Mm-hmm. However, when I sat and I started playing the oud and playing especially tunes from his days, he started singing. And he completely remembered every single intonation, the whole melody, the tune, the rhythm, and he was playing rhythm with us, no problem.
There's a lot of research at the moment on the connection between memory and music.
And that's what I wanted.
Especially autobiographic memory and music.
That's what I wanted to ask you about, because I'm really fascinated by that, this connection of music and memory.
Mm-hmm. Music is fantastic in inducing a kind of reminiscent state or fostering something nostalgic, maybe even regressive, perhaps, but not necessarily in a true regressive way. You don't, fall back to an earlier state, but it can hearken you back to something earlier.
I have to take this moment to give an example of that very thing. I have to unplug, though. How do I? Jim, help me out here.
Just this perfect opportunity came up because you said that.
And I think the age group of this audience will be absolutely right for this experiment. We have a slightly out
I
of
thought you said out of tune, exactly. That's what I was going to
slightly out of tune
say.
piano here. But I'm going to play you something that you may recognize instantly. It may make you smile. I don't know. Maybe it's crazy, but it may trigger memory. Did it work? Anybody remember Summer Place? Yes. The make-out tune of the 1960s.
Okay.
I'm not sure I want to take responsibility for that association.
I didn't even have to play the melody. Jim knows this recording, Percy Faith, 1960.
Same studio's Kind of Blue.
Oh my goodness.
There's something going on.
I remember when I YouTubed this piece of music because I was trying to think of something, a little piece of something that I could just play the most remotest piece, not even the melody, and people go, yeah. And so I Googled up a theme from Summer Place. Up comes a video of Percy Faith and his orchestra, 1961, in the studio.
In 30th Street, yeah.
And Jim actually knows the recording studio.
And probably the engineer. I mean, it was either Fred Plout or Frank Lako, one of the two staff engineers. They did all that material.
So one of the things that I think is interesting about that is that probably if we polled everyone here, anyone who recognized what you played and had some link to it would have a shared experience, that there would be some, common cultural understanding of what that piece signifies and, where it was in the firmament. But also, given its theme, that there might be some very idiosyncratic association to it that wouldn't be shared. And that, we could say, is paramusical in a way, that the music is just a trigger to something else, like what you were talking about for all of these ritualistic propulsions towards something that everyone does together, but it has probably an individual meaning for each one of those participants.
Right.
You have your
That's
own.
what you call subjective.
Yeah.
I understand. Do you use music in therapy?
No,
You don't?
there's a lot to learn about music therapy. I don't know really anything about it. I'm not trained in it. I never bring music into an analytic session.
Yeah. I mean, there have been attempts, I know, like in language teaching, because that's my other profession too. Methods that were developed in Russia, say, for example, late 50s and et cetera, that actually believe that having a music in the background, sort of induces. I don't know if I have that feeling if I had Tchaikovsky in the back playing. I wouldn't hear any language, I'd be probably listening to him and feeling like, totally tense. So I don't know who, how they choose their music, etc. But apparently, the idea came mostly from psychoanalysts, and people who are interested in that having the music in that surrounding encourages actually the students to learn more.
I know many, for instance, artists like that I know of have painted with music, but I know hardly any writer who would ever use music and write at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's because it interferes with linguistic processes, which you're probably not using when you're painting to the same extent.
Alexander also writes beautifully, though, about the use of silence in relationship to sound. And that's worth talking about. Please, take it away.
I owe everything I know to John Cage. I think in one of the, Josh, I don't know terribly much about the research protocols and instruments you use, but the problem, as you talk of it, of the infection of Western music and the way in which perhaps it can be extracted, maybe some of that is coming from an overvaluation of the music itself, rather than some of the underlying processes involved in listening to music or the experience.
Meaning that the researchers value Western music?
Well, yeah, my sense, without much knowledge about it, is that if the research instruments were structured with less reliance on a particular piece of music, in other words, you could probably use Sufi music just as easily as you could So What, that you can probably come to the same results without thinking so much about what the music is. So, thinking about music less as organized around some ethnicity or culture, but more as a collection of sounds and silences that distribute themselves in rhythmic and tonal patterns and that operate in the auditory realm and function in a way similar to language, that it has some kind of linear syntactical unraveling to it that we process. But not as, Western music or Eastern music or serial music.
Yeah.
So, So What from Kind of Blue has a particular response to us. Maybe if we think about it musicologically, if that interval didn't go, if it didn't descend, but it ascended, we would have a vastly different reaction to it.
Its structure is almost call and response,
Yeah.
actually, too. So I think that might be another visceral thing. I also think that I don't believe there is really silence, actually, frankly. If you think of like the work of Murray Schafer and thinking about soundscapes, I mean, this room is filled with various sounds. There's little ticks outside. You never really escape sound, period.
I'm glad you mentioned Schafer. This book, if you don't know it, called Soundscapes, the Tunings of the World.
Tuning of the World, yeah.
It is just a remarkable piece, which I think is really significant for anyone who's interested in this topic to read. And it really focuses your mind and your ears to the tremendous influence of all of the ambient qualities of existence. For instance, I think about this type of thing when I'm listening to a patient who might respond to various sounds coming through the window from outside, for instance, and how people respond to a siren or a car horn or a dog barking, or as the case may be, and to know something about what was the auditory environment, the sound world, as Schafer would talk about it, when they were growing up. Was it rural? Was it urban? Did they live near a train station? Did they live near a church? Were there people yelling all the time? Were there TVs on all the time? Were there drums going in the background? Or were there lots of little kids? This whole world of sound that people are just stewed in.
And sometimes it's just oblivious to at the same time.
We don't think about it.
Yeah. I mean, Schafer, the one thing that Schafer talked about was also you could notate it almost like music, with time being the bass line. Anyone that's, say, my age and worked at NPR in the 70s, we all read that book. That was sort of like our Bible. And we used it as the basis of a lot of documentary, and also going into locations, listening and saying, okay, what are the sounds that I need that I can come back and recreate the environment that I'm in, or that I was in.
Our grandparents were born in a time before anyone knew what the sound of an airplane was, for instance.
I remember the first time I was probably maybe 2 years old playing outside, and a jet went overhead, and I remember running in absolutely frightened as hell and had no idea what that sound was, and somebody had to explain that to me. And then shift forward maybe 30, 40 years, I'm sitting on a dock with my son at 11 o'clock at night, loving the stars, and he's about 6 years old, and a car across the lake goes by. You hear the little whoosh, and he had the same reaction. What was that? He didn't know how to interpret that sound. And for us, it's a car in the distance, but for him it was a totally alien experience.
I have an anecdotal thing that fits right into that experience. There's a signature movement quality in my playing. I'm very interested in how sound changes when it moves. So I'll take the bell of the saxophone and I'll create this almost Doppler-like effect with it. And I kept thinking to myself, why am I interested in that? And it came to me one day, I don't know what hotel I was staying in, but I was lying in bed and listening to the sound of the turnpike. And I was remembering, when I grew up, I lived just outside of Boston, near Route 128. And when I was a kid, I would hear the constant whine of the high... And it was, talk about a sound bringing back a memory, lying in bed, when you're little. And here it comes forward today to something that I use in my own orchestrations.
Sure. I can remember the Brooklyn Bridge used to be a grate, and so you'd hear this drone going across. And I remember that right after they paved it, my 2-year-old, as we're driving across it's paved, she started humming as if she was going to experience the same pitch that she always heard before. And it wasn't there anymore, and she's looking around going, wait, this used to hum. And I used to hum with it, obviously, and we never heard it because it was drowned out by the tires on the grate of the Brooklyn Bridge.
So here's where I would propose that perhaps neuroscience can teach us more about the nature of memory when it's deployed in the realm of music, particularly because it's not lexical. There are so many very specific things about the construction and retrieval of memory when it's tied to language to be able to describe it. But if you can find ways of helping us see what the brain is doing when people are remembering something that isn't descriptive or isn't narrative in any way, which is just...
Why do you say that music is not narrative?
Well, that's a whole different discussion. But for the moment, what I'm saying is that experiments which are tied to subjects being able to respond to something, a spoken stimulus, which you're then going to read, is constrained in a way, I think, because of its linguistic nature. But music, even if we can talk about its having narrativistic elements, is not intrinsically narrative. It
doesn't have the same kind of semantics, certainly. That's pretty uncontroversial, I guess. There's been some work done on this. There's an interesting example of a patient with brain damage that seems to have selectively impaired memory for songs, and memory for a lot of other things is just fine, sort of indicating that our memory stores are sort of segregated, topically or something. I've always been I've had the impression, which many of you have kind of made mention of, that there is this kind of intimate and special relationship between music and memory, and just that in it seems a very powerful mnemonic stimulus. But I think the actual hard evidence for that has been somewhat elusive. I recently heard someone present a study at a meeting where they were trying to find evidence that memory for music is special, and so they tested people for memory of tunes that were on the pop charts various numbers of years back in time, as well as testing their memory for the faces of individuals in their high school yearbooks, and they could match those in terms of the number of years back that it went, and they found that there was no advantage for the songs. People were equally good or bad depending on your perspective at recognizing the faces of people they went to high school with, as they were of recognizing songs that were being played a lot on the radio at that time. So I think it may be that music it's not necessarily it doesn't have a special relationship with memory, but it has a special relationship with emotion. And so when we do remember something, it evokes a sense that maybe is different from a face in your high school yearbook. That it makes you remember all these emotions that you were feeling at the time.
There's an author named Chimasiero, I believe, who's written about induced song recall. Perhaps some of her work would be relevant. But it seems to me that you can have a non-specific recollection to a tune or a face without being able to place it. You don't know the song and you might know the face, but you may have some response to it. I don't know who you are, but I know how I feel, or some such.
All this is making me think also of poetry and how it stands in between music and language, because we're talking about language, and it's making me think of the musicality of language. As we speak to, say, infants, etc., what do they perceive? What do they hear from us? It's making me think that actually some of the earliest pieces of history we have in all of humanity have come in the form of, poetry and songs, and that in fact that they're in that form so that they be retained. They're designed for memory so that we remember them because they rhyme, because they have the rhythm, they have musicality.
Well, there's certain, in Somalia, for example, there wasn't a written lexicon until maybe about 15 or 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And the fact that there were people from each group that were the keepers of the stories. Mm-hmm. And sometimes these stories would go on for days and days and days, and they would be repeated verbatim, and they would be passed down. And that was the only way that they had to transfer their collected knowledge. Yeah. The other side that I found interesting when I was there was the fact that all of their music was very much call and response, and was also totally just a single line. There was no harmony at all. They had melody, but they had no harmony.
Yeah, it's like Arab music too. Mm-hmm. There's no harmony. So the melodic line is really what's important. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then you talk about a lot of these oral traditions, because writing to all of us has come at a much later stage, for all of humanity. We spoke for a long time before we wrote anything down, and so in a way, the sound is sort of much more important, and in a way that too was very musical, But then. What do we do? We're thinking of poetry and the musicality of poetry, and then how do we react to that? Or why is it that also when there's a song, everybody kind of pops in and remembers immediately what the words are, especially aided by the music. But a lot of people find it really hard when you tell them, can you just dictate the lyrics for me of that particular song?
It's connected. Yeah.
They'd have to sing it, so that they get to that. So that connection is really very strong, because after all, language is primarily made of sound, which is sound.
Like the ABC songs.
Yeah.
Speaking of music, are you going to play something for us?
You want me to play something?
Yes.
I can play. I'll show you the turnpike effect. Yeah. Oops.
Right.
Oh, here's the turnpike effect. Newton, Massachusetts, Route 128, 1955.
That's good.
I moved my water.
And so on. But let me play a little something for you, because I thought it would be apropos, and who knows, even the drums may come out. But I'm going to play a piece I wrote years ago. Yeah, why not?
I'm going to just
Enjoy having a drone with me here. I have to stand up to do this. was a piece called Climb Inside Her Eyes. And then, thanks to my Regini digital tambura playing along with me. We've got to ask Taoufiq just to play a little bit for us. Just to hear this beautiful drum.
I'm thinking, I'm listening to you, and I was thinking like of how a lot of actually this ritual music that I know of is basically very, very simple in melodies. It's like very cyclical, very repetitive, and I think it's so obviously like one of the secrets of inducing a certain state of being. And I don't know why frame drums have been like sort of an instrument of choice. This is mine are made of skin, so I take a heating pad to heat them actually when it's like really humid. Otherwise they relax a little too much, and I prefer the skin sound. So this one is a def that's from Aleppo, from Syria. And so basically, if you listen to the sound, it's like, very deep, and maybe I'll play a rhythm or something.
Very quiet. Have you experienced a trance, or have you been able to induce one with this music? Might some of us go into a trance?
Wow, you're really putting me on the spot. Huh? I'd say both.
You've experienced
both. But then you come out of the experience not knowing that you have, you can
swear that you.
It's really hard, yeah. I mean, people tell you you've been in a funny state, but that's the idea. You don't feel it. So. And then maybe you will have these expressions of Allah Hay, Allah Hay, Allah Hay. So basically what you're doing is you're saying Allah is forever alive, but then you are also breathing in a certain way. So you get over-oxygenated, and of course you feel lightheaded, right? And it's like, so it's almost like having these mantras, these certain expressions that are believed to induce breathing in a certain specific way, and to kind of make your voice and your body react in a certain way. It's also the word Allah, which is supposed to be the most, blessed or mysterious of all words, for all of the letters. So I don't know if you want to try with me, that would be nice. So if you go like, it's basically Allah Hay, and then you have to breathe in so that you keep the rhythm. Allah Hay, Allah Hay, Allah Hay, Allah Hay, Allah Hay, Allah Hay. Gets faster, right? For a while, you're already feeling, your body has been like really participating, in the whole thing. Plus, there'll be dancing, and it's very communal. It's really actually really close to what you're saying. This is why it fascinated me that you can live this experience so subjectively, so as an individual, and yet you're part of this group that's actually participating in the whole ritual. So it makes it really interesting. I wanted to have you just listen to the second drum from North Africa. It's the same thing. Except that these drums have a snare in the back, and it's believed actually that buzzing sound at the end is where the jinn live, so it's actually that note that gets you, because it creates like a little bit of an overtone.
I just wanted to interject that maybe you can recalibrate your definition of simple. Your rhythm is by no means simple. You have both hands, and with your left hand you have a syncopated rhythm and a little appoggiatura that's leading up to the main rhythm that is part of what agitates us.
Right. It's okay. It's good to hear it this way. I'm talking about rhythms, that go 50 cycles and 51, 52 cycles. So the rhythm that I was playing was like just you could consider it a 2 if you play it like really fast. So relatively speaking, it's not a very complex. Anybody could participate. It's like you can get even like a young child and they can actually follow this rhythm. It's nothing like a 9 or an 11 or something like that. That's how I meant it. But so this drum is called bendir. It's used in Turkey, used in North Africa. And Turkey doesn't have the snare in the back. North Africa does have the snare. And then you get the combination of the Sufi with the African traditions, that predated Islam in there. And so it's really amazing. You have, the 7 colors sort of integrated into Islam, the 7 African gods and all of this. So maybe I'll play a rhythm for you that to me sounds a lot like hip-hop, but it's a very Sufi rhythm that's used a lot in Tunisia. What was that?
How fast do the accelerandos can they get?
They get very fast. They get extremely fast. Extremely fast.
Very fast.
Extremely fast.
You ever slow down instead of real fast?
Well, actually, generally, I don't know why, but the pattern is like to go very slow, and then there's a certain point at which the switch happens. It's in Sufism, it's called the moment of where you almost flip from the conscious to the unconscious. It's like it's the moment of getting into the experience. The veil of senses is kind of lifted up. And so what they do is they go from a very straight rhythm, that builds up, maybe a 4 or an 8, and then they switch into a 3 or a 6 or something like that, and it becomes extremely fast.
Maybe that gives a reason why.
That moment is pronounced. Yeah, it goes up, and then at the end they go, ooh, just to relax it, because there's no way to keep it, going up.
Jane, do you want to consider opening the
of course. Please, yeah.
I just want to say, I think we have an explanation why bass players and drummers rush.
Why?
They get into this altered experience, and they just start rushing like crazy. So.
And it's the effect of rhythm. I think we all react to rhythm in the most amazing way. It's like it's as if like it's a very, I don't know what to say other than such a primitive sound that everybody can move to. It seems so natural, sounds so natural, and very quickly gets us into that state of very cyclical, very. So I don't know the science behind it. This basically, but.
We have a question.
Yeah, actually, it's more like a couple of comments because I think, I guess I'm clearly on the side of Steve Mythen and not Pinker, that I think that music has a basic and very early significance in terms of emotional expression and communication, and that one of the purposes that it seems to serve is building community and communal experiences, and that in connection with that if you think of the earliest soundscape, it was our mother's heartbeat and the sounds of her body. And that we grew up first in that environment, and there's some research about using the mother's heartbeat to calm babies after they get out into the world. And that music, like breathing, has this interesting capacity to either be a product of what's going on or create what's going on, so that as you breathe differently, you change your emotional state. And as your emotional state changes, your breathing changes. And similarly, with the rhythm, especially in music, that your body state starts to change, and then how difficult it is, like if you have a cold, if for women if they're getting their period, or that, and you're playing an instrument and your body rhythms are sort of out of sync, how difficult that can be, because it's...
Oh, well, very interesting.
Could you say who you are? Curious.
I'm Cynthia Sayer, and
What do you do?
I'm a musician.
Okay.
I was wondering if any of you could comment on the whole. I think many people know that musicians get in what we call a zone, when everything comes together and you feel like you can do no wrong. And it's this incredible feeling that, I don't know, I think it's one of the reasons why some people are musicians, to keep trying to find this feeling. And I've heard that it's very similar with athletes. Runner's high and a certain kind of mental state and a chemical thing that happens. I was wondering if you could comment. I mean, as someone who loves music so much that I actually will do it for a living, why is this particular feeling elusive, in my opinion? Hearing it, there's a certain degree you can go to when you hear it, but it's very different when you participate. There's a different kind of chemical thing that goes on that can bring you. For me, the feeling is actually wild. It's a wild kind of release, and it's an incredible euphoria. And even if I listen back to something that we played where we all felt this collective feeling, we can't necessarily even discern that it was there at the time. It's something that's at the moment. I mean, what's the difference with the listening versus the participating and triggering that final high?
Once again, I feel that also depends on the definition of music. I mean, in African music, as you probably know, participation is essential. Like in Arab music, for example, if the audience sits and doesn't egg on the musicians, you don't really express your liking or dislike, and people would think it's really strange. So, then the participation in those contexts is really much stronger. It's almost like an African dancer telling the master drummer what to do, because they lead. It's not the drummer who's leading. But I think, in Arabic there's a word for this. It's called tarab. And I know that having a word for it doesn't mean that they figured it out. They called it the zone, They called it tarab. And tarab is this state of catharsis that apparently they think happens in many things. Like if you hear great poetry, it happens as well. If you hear great music, it happens as well. And it seems to be actually the ultimate goal of a good Arab musician. So if you're a singer, they call you mutrib, the one who imparts tarab. And if you can actually leave a concert sometimes and you ask somebody and you say, how did you feel about the music? They would say, I didn't get any tarab. Or the musician would tell you, we were not in tarab. It means that we didn't hit that zone, and therefore, it didn't count, as an experience. But I think at least for me, when I'm playing as a musician, I don't know where it comes from. Like I try to explain it in terms of the music itself, like how the maqam system works in Arab music, because it's so modal. There are ways of sitting and progressing and all of that. But I feel it too when I listen to good jazz. I feel it too when I listen, to all sorts of other music. So
The same degree as when you're participating?
As when I'm playing?
That's my question.
Sometimes even more.
Yeah.
If the musician is really good, sometimes even more, because I wish I was as good as, but it's true. Like if the musician is really good, I feel it even more. Even much, much more. And then I would say, oh my God, I wish I could do that, like we all do. So,
psychoanalysis will use more words than a Sufi musician, but I think we're talking about different facets of psychic functioning and the pursuit or attainment of an ideal state, the affiliated elements of exercising mastery and everything that might entail. Probably a lot of different areas that would be separate and apart from the musical one. And then when you introduce music, then it becomes even more complex.
I'm a little bit puzzled by your question because obviously you would only be in the zone if you are playing. Why would you be in the zone if you're not playing? Because it's something you achieve as a function of what you're doing. You're not there from the moment you start, but it's a state that you work and build towards, and then you are there. So it's not just the music, it's you're doing the music yourself.
Cynthia, sometimes words, the two words I use to describe that feeling that you get when everything is beautiful and you're in the zone. You know, it's happening. You know, it's a different feeling to me than when I'm listening to music and I get something called the chills. When I see my hairs stand up, I'm listening to something that means very much to me. And usually my gauge of whether it really works for me is whether my hairs go up on my arm. And if it does, that's a different experience, not dissimilar, but I think of them as different experiences.
Bruce LaRue, a psychoanalyst, words really suffer at the expense of this wonderful music. Three quick comments. One is a kind of aside in terms of the attraction is related to as related to voice. I was once doing a study on courtship, trying to determine what factors led to increasing commitment, and a very wise psychoanalyst named Ilvin Semrad, this sounds a little sexist, but he said, all you need to do is ask him, how does she smell? As well as other sense organs. And Alexander's comment about smoothing out stuttering or psychosexual conflicts through singing or music. This may have been mentioned and I didn't catch it, but quite obviously it's a kind of regression in the service of the ego to something pre-verbal. So we're not caught up in later stages. And one thought about the motivation to listening to sad music. It may be related to, Freud's work, getting a satisfaction out of the work of mourning. If it gets us in touch with lost people, lost symbols, lost ideas, lost youth, or whatever, there's a comfort in that we experience with or without music, and unless we're terribly depressed in the sadness.
Thank you.
Larry Cutler, why would the listener enjoy, and more than enjoy, being in his zone or her zone, his zone, based on some music like jazz, for example, rather than say Western music? And why is sometimes the music superior to the film you see or to the TV show? And why? I mean, I enjoyed your thing very much, just as I enjoy your thing very much, and thought it was perfect to a certain extent. Why do we enjoy some music and we don't enjoy other music? I know there's some cultural part to it, but it's more than that.
We didn't get into consonance and dissonance, but we could speak to that a little bit. Or some things I've read about, even fractal qualities of sound. Have you read about this? 1F spectral sound, the difference between white noise and a regular dripping faucet. And most music fits in the middle. Most music fits somewhere in the middle or close to sounds of nature.
That's
I've read something like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact that different people have different personalities, and different types of music tends to occupy sort of different regions of emotional space, and some people like to live in some particular regions of emotional space, and other people like to live in other regions. So I think we tend to listen to music that takes us to a place where we want to be, but not everybody wants to be in the same place, and that's certainly a big part of it, I think, from my perspective.
Not just one person, but a lot of people. For example, in France, they liked jazz when it wasn't like here.
Well, there are cultural components too, of course, but there are also cultural differences in where people like to be emotionally, right? I mean, the French don't like to be in the same place as Americans do. I can tell you that.
Sonic structures have been contextualized in accordance with lots of cultural regulations, and Western music derives from some of the early regulations of church music, and going back even earlier than that, we have rules about what's right and wrong in terms of voice leading or use of parallel fourths or fifths or whatever. But I think a lot of it has less to do with either the sonic or even the musicological function of, let's say, clashing sound, something that is designated dissonant rather than consonant, and much more to do with the larger context in which it comes. When you think about it even linguistically, if someone that you care deeply about says something hurtful to you, it has less to do with the words than the relationship and what you're affected by that. So, somebody, you can utter dissonance and have it experienced as a consonance in a way. It has less, I think, to do with what's happening in the sound patterns.
Although the fact remains that if you play people musical intervals in isolation, there are very consistent patterns, and people will consistently tell you that some of them sound better than others. I mean, what Westerners that is. The issue hasn't really been explored outside of the West.
Think about the necessity of the clashing clusters of sounds in Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, or towards the end, before the final sequence in the Ninth Symphony. Or Mozart's use of dissonance in some of his early piano concerti, which were unheard of in the time in which they were introduced, and yet how important that dissonance is.
But it's also interesting how we eventually catch up to that where the artist was. If you put on Coltrane's Ascension, today it sounds like elevator music. Back then it was completely radical.
I mean, philosophy has not provided us with an answer. I mean, the whole field of aesthetics, I mean, if any of you venture to take a course, as my partner recently has taken a course on aesthetics, I mean, it's like, cracking the question of what is appealing, to us. And I think it brings us back to, to the complexity that I think we all are talking about. Perhaps there is a component to it in terms of like our hearing range, what we construe as like, ideal, sounds that are affected by culture, but I don't think, I don't know how to begin to answer that question.
We have a couple more questions, so I think you're next.
Thank you very much, everybody here in this panel. I wish I could spend hours talking with you.
Who are you?
I'm Eileen Ain, Dr. Ain, and I'm a flutist and a music therapist. And for 35 years, I've been in this world of trying to define and subject, to understand the relationships of sound and growth. And there was a course I developed called New Babies, New Sounds, which worked with sounding in babies. And then that course was brought to, well, it's a whole long biography. But my question is, and this would really go around the board here. In working with trauma, and I'll use my own example of my daughter, who I adopted, and then she was from China. She is from China, and at the beginning I played children singing, and then I noticed that she just regressed, and then finally I figured out that there was something about the sounds that were terrifying to her that she had heard in her orphanage, although I couldn't really say that for sure. But when that sound was off, she was okay. So I brought her to early intervention, and we decided to work with sound, since I was doing this all along. And eventually she was able to tolerate these sounds, but then she had to learn Chinese to master the sounds, so that psychically and internally that those frequencies would not be threatening to her when she organized them. And this is a very important development that it was so personal that I never wrote it up. But to add to this mix, people in coma have been brought out of coma with sound by singing to them and breathing with them, that they've been brought out of that state of coma. And so being brought up on Murray Schafer's soundscape, I really believe that there's a way of tuning for peace, for a sense of peacefulness, and that when you said, what's the relationship between the frequencies of internal and external, that the Sufi tradition would have a lot to say about that in terms of a universal vibration that is more comforting in terms of how we can develop a peaceful sense in the brain and thus live more harmoniously. So that's what I'm working on, and I wanted to just share this and thank you all again for this wonderful panel.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions, and then we'll.
Just to follow up on what you were saying about what feels good and about babies. My name is Alan Silverman, and I'm a sound engineer. I'm very fortunate to work in a beautiful sounding listening room, an audiophile room. And when I say it's beautiful sounding, what I mean is it sounds natural and pleasing to the ear. Some time ago, I had some cousins come in from out of town to see what I do for a living, and they brought with them a 7-month-old baby. And I put on a recording which was meant for the cousins. It's a vinyl recording, kind of a folk rock thing with chunky guitars and big round bass and a beautiful woman's voice. And as the music played, I looked back to see how I was impressing my cousins. But what I saw fully impressed me. The 7-month-old baby, her eyes went wide with wonder, and she was looking around with her mouth open in this beautiful smile. And it was just stunning to see, perhaps for the first time in her life, the sensual primal reaction to beautiful music and beautiful sound. Mm-hmm. So I think this demonstrates what I've always believed, that pleasure response to good music and sound is hardwired into us. And a 7-month-old will tell you when it sounds great.
Carmen.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm Carmen de Lavallade. Dancer. I live in music. It's my life. And I think that we are all, as humans, are great big tuning forks. And we're all vibrating. And everything has its level of vibration. I think when you're sad, that's a vibration. And sometimes if you don't get any vibration, it's because it's on another level. Children who don't have stimulation in the arts and sounds, they don't have that vibration. It's so low. But I've worked with Jane a bit, quite a bit, I must say. But I just feel that, when I heard this and I heard the drums, I can't help it. The body reacts. I can get it. I make a fool of myself when I go to an orchestra, where there's an orchestra, because I can't stop moving. I can't. Well, it's no. I just feel all different kind of vibrations, and I feel that music. It is a vibration that you can feel, and you can go into another level, like with the Sufi. It is, and I've gone there, not as far, but I know what it means. But that's what I just wanted to say. That I just feel that we are, and we're made a lot of water, so it's going to vibrate, and we're going to check. When you're in an audience, I can tell sometimes when the vibration is there and when it isn't, and all of you say, or you'll say something's wrong, or if it's very quiet, then everybody's in the same vibration. So I just wanted to put that little thing there.
Thank you.
My name's Michael Sachs. I'm a lawyer, but this question has nothing to do with that. What I was thinking about, is there a process that would shed some light on the connection between music and language, and perhaps in a specific way on memory? And that would be a process that I know nothing about, but how does an actor remember their lines, and whether or not their process of memorization is related to the various cadences and the musicality in the language, so that there ends up being some direct connection between the sound patterns and then the memory of the actual lines. Has anybody ever looked into that?
We have an actor in the room who could speak to that.
Joe? Joe, go to the mic, yeah.
Do this.
Say who you are.
Joe Grafassi, I'm an actor. And Mr. Jane Ira Bloom, actually.
Get out of here.
And Mrs. Norman Maine. Well, I just tell you one thing that I do in terms of learning lines is I try to learn lines flat without any emotion, because the minute I start to act on the line, all of those indications of what I might do musically or what I emotionally might bring to the line clouds my memorization process. So I have to kind of do them separately, you know what I mean? And I used to try to do them the same, and then one of the problems was in memorizing the line with some sort of attitude, I would bring then a preformed emotion to the interpretation, and I was sort of blocked on the set or on the stage.
Right.
So I try to keep it in a fairly flat, in another mode, almost going, I don't know if I'm going to the left side or what I'm supposed to be doing there, but I'm really trying to go in a very dry, linear fashion, maybe even a visual fashion. And then, you know, at one point, Marlon Brando stopped learning lines, and everybody accused him of being lazy. But in Last Tango in Paris, he started using what they call an earwig, which is just a remote listening device. And he had a woman speaking in a very flat tone the line that was next for him to say, and he claimed that it allowed him to just open up on the line when he had to say it. So it's just a thought.
Right, and I was just looking at it more from emotion on one end.
Yeah.
The word by itself and another, and the sound of the words together in terms of the lines.
Yeah, they
And whether
inevitably,
or not
when you
that has
connect them, it becomes something else. So I think in the dry memorization process, it's a matter of disconnecting them, but making them actually fast and hard, and just a tool that's there to grab for the putty, and now you can do something with it. So, you know, you apply the emotion or whatever happens to an act.
Thank you. The director doesn't use it, right?
What?
And then the director doesn't use it.
Directors are jerks. We don't.
Hi, my name is Merle Molofsky. I'm a human being. Part of my humanity is that I'm a psychoanalyst and a poet, and I actually studied directing as an undergraduate, as a speech and theater major. I met some nice directors. I've met some nice everything. And what I'd really like to talk about is integration, very much in the spirit of the fact that this is interdisciplinary. I was listening downstairs and watching you all on screen, and as I found myself thinking about so many of the questions that were raised, I began to wonder about the power of music, the power of the sacred, the experience of trance, the integration of music and words in poetry. And I thought about some of the questions that were raised, and I thought about the alternation between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system that gets stimulated through rhythm, through trance rhythm, and what happens as it alternates and then integrates. I think we are all we're in search of memory, as Candle wrote, because memory is us. And if music embodies everything that we've ever felt, yearned for, believed, whether it's music we've heard before or music that we are first hearing. So if in Indonesia they're boogieing to Eminem, no, they're hip-hopping to Eminem, and I'm here on the East Coast listening to gamelan music, we are all listening to each other, and I hope we stay integrated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question.
Sure. My name is Sami Bouchamez. I'm a fellow Arab musician with Taoufiq. We play together sometimes. A question first for Josh. Question and comment, and anyone else who wants to respond to it. First, the comment. The comment is that you mentioned the need to go to places within the next 10 years. And I would just say that there are so many world music communities here in New York City that it's actually enough of a resource to start with here. You have not only experts in hundreds of traditions, you have communities of listeners who you could put in a lab and test their responses. So my question is, having read a lot of the literature on the cognitive science and neuroscience of music, as a practicing world musician, I feel like there are certain gaps, and you mentioned you sort of sense that there are gaps. My question for you is, I mean, I could make hundreds of suggestions for how you might approach things, but I want to ask you, what are the questions that you would be interested in asking, in finding out from a cognitive science and neuroscience perspective, that taking different examples of world music could illuminate for you, specifically having to do with the universality of certain aspects of music or lack of universality? What are those questions that you would want to ask?
Great question.
So, I guess I'm most interested in what things are universal about music, because those are the things that probably give us clues to its origins. Obviously, there's lots of things that are different about the musics of different cultures. I mean, if you go around the world, things sound really different a lot of the time. And certainly, if you look at a lot of the research in music cognition, it's just very colored by things that are prominent in Western music, like harmony, for instance, right? So in this sort of academic Western tradition, harmony is a big thing. But there's lots of musical traditions where there's very little of it, right? Another thing is that the rhythmic structures of Western music are often a lot simpler than rhythmic structures of certain other cultures. So I think that's just something we have to be very wary of. I mean, it's perfectly fine to study the perception of Western music, but if we think that that's going to tell us about these sort of greater questions that a lot of us are really interested in, then we need to be careful. So number one, I mean, I think it's important to just sort of do kind of crude structural analyses of all different kinds of music to try to get a sense of what the commonalities really are. It's clear there are lots of differences. And there are communities of people that nominally study this stuff, namely ethnomusicologists, but the dominant tradition in ethnomusicology is really to emphasize the diversity of music. And that's certainly interesting and important. But cognitively, it's also really interesting and important to try to understand what there is that's universal. And clearly there is something that's universal, because we all make something we call music, and it seems to have developed independently many times over. So there is some kind of universal drive to make music. The question is, well, beyond that, what's universal? Is there anything else that we can say? So I think we need to start by doing sort of structural analyses and thinking about things at that level, and then trying to probe perception. And with regard to your first comment, I mean, it's certainly potentially useful to study these communities of people who are here that are into other genres of music, but it might not be enough. For instance, if you find that there are similar sensitivities of those people to sort of your typical Western listeners, I mean, you don't know to what extent the inevitable exposure that they've had to Western music is to be attributed, that's to be attributed to. And there are certain cases where you'd really want to get as pure a sample as you could to try to find somebody that has never heard anything at all. And there just aren't that many places left where you can do that. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question, but that's sort of what comes to mind. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Enrico, and I'm a music therapist. Everyone here represents a different avenue that's going on in music psychotherapy right now. We have transpersonal music therapy, there's humanistic, there's cognitive behavioral, psychoanalytic music therapy. I think the next venture is more of a biological music therapy, and something that I'm interested in is bringing music therapy from the clinical setting into the lab. And an example of that would be I had a patient who had a hyperactive amygdala, and I used music to match his hyperactivity, and I slowly brought him down to a level of more of a peaceful state. And we call it the ISO principle, where you match the response of the patient. But I would like to see what's actually going on inside of the patient biochemically. So I feel that this is a new avenue. I hope there'll be other people interested in this type of research.
Thank you.
What music did you use?
We use, for that instance, it was improvisation, where we engage. This is another thing. Music therapy has been, people think, I think most people think that it's just you're playing music in the background. But music therapy is all sorts of things, where we could do music improvisation. Actually, I used John Cage's piece with one patient of silence. And he started to emote because we had a relationship in the music. which was silence, even though there's construction work going on outside. So it's a whole world that needs to be explored.
Wait, how do you use, you mean the piece 1:12, the silence, or whatever it is?
433.
It's 133. I mean, what's
433.
What happens?
This particular patient wanted to stand up, and we had the music in front of us, which is nothing's written, it's just rests. And I stood with him, and he, I think it was more about the relationship I had with him. He just took in everything around him.
Oh, okay.
Even the construction work outside.
Because there's no input, really.
Yeah, it's a mystery. And drum circles are big in music therapy, which we get into an altered state.
Of course, yeah. They're always like a great thing to do. I mean, it sounds to me like, you maybe we need to get people who experience, trance states or whatever states and put them in labs, with scientists and kind of measure them up and see, at least at the physical level, we can figure out certain things. But in my opinion, it doesn't explain, all the stuff. So, I mean, I like to think that the thousands of years of history have led to some very, very complex knowledge.
Absolutely.
Of who we are. And, but if we can unravel some of it, that would be really nice.
Well, in music therapy, there's a lot of qualitative and quantitative research out there. So much of it. Hope you explore it.
So we have one, and then one, and where's that?
I'm Doris Pfeffer. I'm a therapist and a sometimes musician. I want to relate an incident and then ask Josh McDermott or our psychoanalyst or anybody else on the panel to conceptualize it. I think that's a better way to do it than for me to. I visited somebody in a deep coma. She had been in a coma for 3 days. The nurse said to me, she cannot talk. I don't know if she can understand, but she can hear. Talk to her, and you will see. And I talked to her, and every time I talked, she moved. When the nurse talked, she also moved. The body moved in response to any kind of sound. And I talked to her for several hours. And at one point, she turned to me as I was talking and said, "Mama," and then she died a few hours later. And I'd just like to know if anybody would like to react to that. I mean, I could conceptualize about it, but I'm not sure how general this is, or how there are some individual things here that may be particular to this, but I don't want to make a broad generalization based on this experience, but I wonder if anybody else would like to.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I can tell you anything that will be deeply satisfying. I mean, I guess, when somebody gets into a coma, the brain is pretty seriously out of whack. We don't really understand what happens in coma or when people lose consciousness. It's a bit of a mystery. But something is not the way that it normally would be. And so I think funny things can happen where you stimulate somebody in a particular way, and that can kind of make it into their brain another way they wouldn't necessarily be receptive to. But I don't think we particularly know why. But it's pretty clear that your brain function is drastically altered under those conditions. So you would perhaps expect some unusual things to happen. I mean, in that particular case, I don't really know what's going on. I mean, I do know that when people have lost consciousness and then regain consciousness, the auditory system is often one of the first things that starts working. So typically, before people are able to move, they can hear stuff. Okay. This is sort of commonly reported when people undergo general anesthesia for surgery and things. Again, I don't think anybody really knows why, but that is something that happens. So maybe in comas, that's one thing that sort of has some residual function when everything else doesn't. So.
Thank you.
Okay.
Did you have a question, sir?
Yes. My name's Ethan Janney, and I'm a musician, piano tuner, and I'm hoping to study the brain academically soon. I wrote my question down because I have so many questions. I didn't want to ramble here. Question is, do we really need to separate music and language? Josh made the point that food and sex are evolutionarily necessary. Is there evidence, it's a complicated question, sorry. Is there evidence that language is evolutionarily necessary, or just an option where communication might be the broader thing that's actually necessary? I'm fascinated with the somewhat arbitrary distinction we make between music and sound, or between different types of sounds. A few of you alluded to this like sliding scale, like why do we call this music, why do we call this sound, or separate them? I'm wondering, or maybe for the purposes of scientific study or something, we have to isolate it, we have to say, okay, this is music. I'm wondering if any of you could speak more on where we draw the line and why.
Well, maybe I'll just start quickly and then hand it off to somebody. I mean, I think it's uncontroversial that language sort of has an important function, just in the sense that it's pretty clear that if somebody didn't have the capacity for language, they'd be at a vast disadvantage. I mean, they wouldn't be able to get dates or anything else, right? I mean, but whereas, if you do the thought experiment, suppose someone couldn't enjoy music, would they be able to get dates? Yeah, probably. And in fact, there are examples of people who are tone deaf that don't seem to be able to understand music in the way that most of us can. And they seem pretty normal. Like Teddy Roosevelt was an example, Che Guevara. There's some pretty accomplished people that have this disability. Now, it may be that if you carefully measure things, you'd be able to find something subtle. But there's certainly nothing that hits you over the head. Whereas, if you lose the ability to make use of language, you're in trouble.
Well,
yeah, but
those two guys both like pretty well permanently manic. I believe Teddy Roosevelt certainly was, and I think Che Guevara too.
Well, that's probably true of most politicians, right? I mean.
But the point is though is that if you're going to take food and sex and make those what you're going to say is evolutionarily important. I mean, there's all sorts of organisms that have sex and food, but not language, and they survive. So why would you say music is not necessary? Why don't we say language is not necessary too, and just say that communication is necessary, for example? Whether it's just neurons communicating to each other, or viruses communicating the way that they communicate. Maybe that's why separate music and language. Why separate all these different types of sounds?
Well, I mean, there's probably lots of answers that one could give to that. I mean, I think one point that maybe is worth making is that I think the function that some capacity serves is sort of specific to the niche that an organism occupies. I mean, there's some organisms that reproduce asexually, right? In which case they don't need to have sex. So it just so happens that the niche that humans are in is one in which verbal communication has proven to be a huge advantage, which we presume is why we evolved the capacity for language. Now, I mean, it's not completely uncontroversial. I mean, for instance, if you talk to Chomsky, I don't know what he thinks these days, but there was a time when he wasn't really on board with this whole idea that language is an adaptation. So I wouldn't say that it's got completely widespread acceptance, but it's an idea that has a lot of plausibility to a lot of people. And the same idea about music is less clear. Now, you're asking, well, what's the distinction between music and language? I guess was sort of
I think part of the reason I didn't state this, but I read one of Steven Pinker's books, and he said that music is auditory cheesecake. Well, why would you say music as opposed to language? If other organisms don't have any language, music, cheesecake, whatever. It's sure you could say anything is arbitrarily necessary because you have this niche, right? So you're saying we have this niche where we need language, but maybe but some people are saying maybe we don't need music. We just need language, but not music. If you're going to say it from that perspective, I'm not saying you're saying this. I'm mostly saying maybe somebody like Steven Pinker has said this. You might not need music, but you need language for our niche. Right. For example, if you're going to put it in that term of a niche.
If you go back to just your thought that it's the nature of communication that's so important, try to imagine like an alternative universe, like the Bizarro world or something, where somehow humans never developed the ability to make music.
Yeah.
what would happen? You know what, I was trying to think about this. You know, would it be the drive, because I'm a musician, the drive to make music is so strong. Does it depend on my ears? Does it depend on my ability? No, it's something in my mind. I'm thinking, if we didn't develop music, maybe I would, humans would have evolved into a vibrational way of communicating, or maybe a coloristic way of communicating. But I think the drive, or whatever it is that's in the brain that makes you want to make music, it would find another way to do something else to satisfy whatever that thing is that makes you want to make music. That's my thought.
And with that note, we have one more question.
You have a question? Hi. My name is Mesanjo. I come from Chile. Sorry, my English is very good. And I studied in Chile, acoustic engineer, and all my life I work in sound. But I am seeing here, it's very poetic. I see that, but for this side of the room, the science, yeah, and the another side, the musician, yeah, and in the middle, a microphone. And I say that because when I studied, we have to learn about electroacoustic, and we have to learn how a microphone you have to use. How is how the sound input in the microphone, and you can record. And I am thinking who I am, who we are in this sense, because if you think how the sound travel across the microphone and is transformed in an electrical wave and go across the cable and blah blah blah, and in another sense is converted in the same by a loudspeaker and come and input in your ear, and is transformed the pressure level in your tympanos, yeah, and your brain interpretate that with some sound, and you only can listen between 20 hertz and 20
kilohertz. 20,000 kilohertz.
20,000 kilohertz. And the another sound you don't hear, but exist. And after the physics say, all you see is an interpretation. What happened is...
What's happening? We're experiencing the world with the means we have. You know, apparently whales hear other sounds, and so do elephants. You know, and their range of hearing is really stunning. I mean, when people tell you that blue whales can communicate over hundreds of miles, with each other, it just stuns you. I think they're much more evolved than we are sound-wise, in some way. But I think that this might be just the window through which we're experiencing, sound. What I'm really interested in is how do we experience it without having necessarily to think of it in through what you were talking about, which is more like a very Darwinian model of what is essential to our survival, what is really important, as if music is not really so important to our survival as, say, language is, or and maybe in that way we'll think of it in a more global way, as opposed. I'm trying to respond also to what you said, and there's continuity in sound, in language, in poetry, as I was saying earlier, and in music as well. It seems that they all kind of interconnect.
And some people define music differently too. You know, some music, that's not music. You'll play them and listen to this music.
Yeah.
Music, that's not music. What are you talking about?
Right.
You know? Thanks a lot.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philip Tades events is available at philiptades.org.